And then he goes on and he says, so if you kiss your wife or you kiss your child, remind yourself that they're mortal. So when they die, you're not going to be so upset. And now that strikes people as really cold. People are, many people read that and they're like, that's enough of Stoicism for me, because I don't want to be a heartless tyrant. But he's not saying don't love them. He's saying, look, you are fond of them. So remind yourself that the mortality rate for human beings is 100%. Everybody that you know, either you're dying before them, or they're dying before you, or you're dying at the same time,
Today's guest is Greg Sadler. Greg aims to bring philosophy into practice, making complex classic philosophical ideas accessible for a wider audience and not just academics. And based on the evidence of his nearly 4 million views on his YouTube channel, he appears to be achieving his aim. Greg is a certified philosophical counsellor, a public speaker, an author, an ethics trainer, and an executive coach, among other things. He's also the editor of Stoicism Today, and that is what we talked to him about in this episode in particular. The Stoics and their views on death, and how this can help us live a better life by contemplating death, and consequently developing the resources to help us deal with it when it shows up in our lives, which it inevitably will. Please support the show by liking and sharing this episode on social media, and to make sure you don't miss out on any future episodes, sign up for our newsletter at deathhangout.com or by clicking on the button on screen. Now, this episode, the human mortality rate is 100%.
They talk about young people being unaware of they're sooner or later going to die. And I was talking with another friend and colleague of mine, and we were talking about Heidegger and being towards death and all this sort of stuff. And we weren't doing it in a gloomy way, which is good too. And he pointed out that he'd never had that sort of thing. He always knew as a kid that that death could approach at any moment. So he had to pay attention to what he was doing. And I had somewhat of a similar experience. I was able to kind of put it in the background. Coming from a family where it's a large family, there's always somebody dying. So you're conscious of that. It's very helpful for putting things in perspective. The Stoics talk about, if you were going to find out that you were going to die today, what would you do? And this is a great exercise. There's a lot of people who've done this too, and there's some interesting stories about Christian saints who said, well, I wouldn't do anything different than what I'm currently doing, because if I'm not doing the right thing, then things are off already. And there's this great passage in Epictetus where he's up on trial. He's being tried, sort of in absentia. And of course, the whole thing is jury rigged, and he's going to lose no matter what, because it's all political. And so they tell him, okay, you've been sentenced. That's fine. What's the sentence? Exile. Fine. Let's go have lunch. And they said, well, what if you were going to be executed? Well, then we'd still go have lunch, because you still have to go on.
You've still got
living.
The hour, haven't you? Was that Agrippa? Is it?
It might have been.
Yeah, I remember reading that. I used that story in some of the training and the workshops that I do. I think it's a brilliant one. You've got the hour, so it's why let your death enjoy a good lunch?
I think the people that are usually most panicked about death, it's because they haven't been thinking about important things, or they've been putting it off for a long time. It's been in the back of their mind, and they've been saying, I've got time. And then suddenly a health crisis hits, or perhaps, political instability or something like that. It's brought up suddenly how messed up their affairs are. If they have any, people that they're leaving behind, they might be thinking, oh, this is a terrible mess that I'm leaving them to sort out. But they might just be thinking about their own situation and things like their legacy or the things they've left undone. If our lives are fairly well organized, that's not a reaction that we're going to have if we thought about what matters to us. I mean, I imagine this is part of what your workshops help to provoke in the participants, right?
And it's the the time that we waste, it's the time that we throw away, that we have in front of us right now, worrying about what might happen, and it gets in the way of us making the right decision or doing the right thing. But I like what you said there, and I think this fits into the, if you like, the life coach element, where we're linking the death. We're looking to link the death in. And this is what I like from the Stoics. It's about living that life of virtue. So whatever that means for any particular individual, but if you're living the life the way you want to live it, then you're going to do the things that you won't regret. You're not going to do the things that you would regret not doing. If you're living a life in accordance with who you are, like with living a life with intention, then you're going to have less fear of death. Because as you said, what is it we're going to fear at the end? We're going to fear leaving things undone. We're going to fear not having things in order and the pressure it might put on people. So exactly as you said.
Yeah.
So
the thing about virtue, so if you look at the 4 virtues that the Stoics particularly single out, which the same ones that Plato had focused on, what we call the cardinal virtues, wisdom, justice, temperance, and courage, each of them plays an important role in how we approach death, but also in how we structure our life. So practical wisdom, understanding what really is good for us, what's not quite so valuable, that helps out. Justice is really key, because if we encounter death and we think, oh, my life has been such a mess, it's probably because we were doing the wrong things, and we let people down, and we didn't take the chance to be benevolent when we could, which is part of justice. And then courage, facing death as it is. You get the impression from some of the Stoics that, or some interpreters of Stoicism, that death shouldn't be scary at all. And I don't see that in some of these, great thinkers like Seneca or Epictetus. They understand that death scares the hell out of most people. The idea is to, think about why that is, and get yourself to the point where you can face it and see that it's not quite so bad. And then temperance is not a popular term these days, but self-control, being intentional about what we eat, what we drink, who we get in relationships with, all those sorts of things. It really helps to, it conduces to a life that makes sense for us.
But can I ask you actually to go a little bit backwards and to introduce us to the Stoicism, actually, what it is? Because I believe we have this idea of being a Stoic, which is maybe not what it is exactly today. To me, if you ask anybody what is Stoic is basically somebody who endure pains without any feelings, and this kind of Stoicism, which maybe is not what is exactly what it's all about. So maybe if you can introduce us again the elements.
I like to make a distinction between Stoicism, capital S, and then Stoicism, lowercase s. Lowercase s is the disposition that you just described, where the person is unemotional and resists or endures pain and doesn't let it show. Sometimes it gets tied in with kind of a macho attitude too, And I think some people are attracted to Stoic texts because they hear about that and they're like, yeah, that's for me, some of the hyper masculine interpretations of it. It's a misinterpretation, because the Stoics didn't say that all of the emotions are bad. They think, rational joy, rational caution, which is a sort of fear, rational desire. These are good for us. There are some things that we should want. And they also talk about what we translate as familial affection, philostorge in Greek, which is, the kind of thing that you feel for your parents or your kids. And they think this should be extended outward to other people, so that we have this goodwill towards them. It's not that they're unemotional, but they do recognize that our emotions often take us off track. And, when it comes to death, there's a lot of potential for that. Not just because, the 2 core things that we have to deal with is like thinking about our own death, which provokes fear, sometimes pain, thinking about what we're not accomplishing, the desire to live a few more days. But then also our encounter with death is primarily other people's death. and how we're going to deal with that. We have to think about, the death of spouses or colleagues or people that are overseas who we don't even know that we keep getting bombarded with. So Stoicism develops in a time when this is actually much more common, right? Because people were not living as long in the ancient world, and they didn't have quite so many ways of isolating death off like we contemporary moderns do, right? Where you rarely see a dead person. So Stoicism develops as a philosophy. It's one of the ones that traces itself back to Socrates. There's a guy, Zeno. I'm going to sort of fast forward a bit. There's a guy, Zeno, who's a couple generations removed from Socrates, and he kind of cobbles together what he likes from different philosophical systems and develops it into a coherent system that, you mentioned virtue. One of his ideas is virtue is what we ought to be aiming for. But this covers a lot. And many things that we treat as terrible things are actually, if we look at them carefully, they're actually not so bad. They may, in fact, even be what he calls indifferent. Not preferred indifference. They're ones that we would rather not have, but they don't damage us as human beings in our core. They devoted themselves to moral development, but it's not moral development going off on your own. I think this is another thing about the lowercase s Stoic. There's this notion that you get isolated and you don't form attachments to other people. That's the opposite of Stoicism. Actual real Stoicism was about living out your duties and your roles within the whole fabric that you're living in, and trying to be, affectionate to other people, trying to be good to other people, in part because they thought that's the kind of animal that we are. We're rational animals. And being rational doesn't just mean, like having a calculator in your head or doing logic. It means having, social impulses. I mentioned familial affection. This takes place at almost an instinctual level with that. And Epictetus has this really wonderful passage where he's talking to a father, and he chews the guy out a bit, as we say, because the guy comes to him and Epictetus says, "Hey, what's it like being a dad? I'm not a dad. What's it like?" And he's, "Oh, it's terrible. My kid is sick, and I was so upset about it, I had to leave." And Epictetus says, "Wait a second, you left your sick kid alone?" No, the mom's there and the nurse is there, but I was just so upset. I was so worried about her dying that I had to go somewhere else. And Epictetus says, "Something's wrong here. This doesn't really make sense. You're doing this out of familial affection, and yet you're leaving this child who, you're supposed to be a mature adult. The kid, think about their emotions. Would you like somebody to leave you on a sick bed?" And he says, "Oh, no, I would like people to take care of me." Well, why the hell didn't you stick around and take care of your kid like the nurse and the mom did? And eventually he gets the dad to realize that, this is not motivated by familial affection. It's motivated by something else instead. And that's the sort of thing that I think was a very common occurrence in the ancient world. Children getting sick, and probably dying. Mortality rates are very high. And so Stoicism developed to deal with these sorts of things, but to deal with them in, you might say, in a humane way.
So what is the main message then? So what is the approach from Stoicism with death? So how should we act? How should we behave having this, in front of us? There's
a few different aspects to it. One of them is realizing that death is physical death is something unavoidable. It's in the nature of bodies to break down. Epictetus, again, he's sort of my go-to guy. I probably like him more than I like Marcus Aurelius or Seneca or Musonius. Not that I don't like those guys, but I really like.
Do you have a poster? Just like to see how much of a fan you are.
Oh, I wish I should. That's not a bad idea. That would be kind of cool. Shoot with Epictetus behind me. The trouble is we don't have any statues of him like we do with the other ancient guys. We just have some like old woodcuts, from what people imagine he might have looked like. Anyway, he's talking about this in the Enchiridion, and this is a passage that really bothers a lot of people. Mm-hmm. It's very early on. It's like chapter 3, and he says, whenever you are finding something useful for yourself, or you like it, or you're fond of it, you feel affection towards it, remind yourself about what it is. So, he uses one example which none of us are going to have a problem with. If you have a favorite cup, realize it's a cup and it's going to break. And I break dishes all the time. And I used to probably feel worse about it. And then he goes on and he says, so if you kiss your wife or you kiss your child, remind yourself that they're mortal. So when they die, you're not going to be so upset. And now that strikes people as really cold. People are, many people read that and they're like, that's enough of stoicism for me, because I don't want to be a heartless tyrant. But he's not saying don't love them. He's saying, look, you are fond of them. So remind yourself that the mortality rate for human beings is 100%. Everybody that you know, either you're dying before them, or they're dying before you, or you're dying at the same time. And I think that's not the end of things, right? Because that could lend itself to a kind of cynicism and withdraw. Everybody's going to die, so screw all of you. I'm not going to be connected. Instead, he's saying, no, you should love your children and your spouse and your friends and engage in, your job and politics and all these sorts of things. Just don't expect that it's going to somehow last forever. And I think that's pretty good advice.
It's be aware that this isn't going to last forever. It's not sit down and dwell on the fact that everything is going to go, because that would be depressing. It's just basically just as a quick reminder, this isn't here forever. How important is it? How do you want to be in this moment with these people? What do you want to do? It's that little reminder. But I think that's where scares people off. They're going, that's so morbid to sit there and think about that. We're not saying sit there and dwell on it. We're not saying sit there and go into that place and imagine what it's like. And when they're gone, you drive yourself nuts.
The Stoics did practice what we call the premeditation of evils. And so thinking about death is something that they do suggest doing, but there's a terminus to it. It's not done endlessly. And you would pick, if you were really disciplined about it, you would have a particular time of the day where you would set aside and for 5-10 minutes think about not just death, but all the other bad things that could happen. Like you get older, your body breaks down. You can get sick, you can lose your money. The economy that we live in, we know how precarious everything is. There's all sorts of things that could go wrong. And the idea is there's two parts to it. There's the having it in mind that this is a possibility, probably not a possibility that's looming in your face right now, but it's a possibility. And then there's the thinking about how you would deal with it, what resources you have to, if you think about, a violent death, do you have the resources to deal with that? Well, what would the resource be? It would be courage. Or if you're going to be placed in a terrible situation, which hopefully none of us will ever be, of say, being in a totalitarian dictatorship and being told, if you don't inform on these people, we're going to kill you, you would need to see if you can exercise justice and courage in that case. It's different than what you were talking about, just sort of morbidly sitting there saying, oh, I'm going to die, this really sucks, That's not good. But if you do it in a structured way, then it can be quite liberating.
As soon as I tell people we do a podcast and it's about death, and a lot of time it's, whoa, no, I don't want to think about it. But it's doing it in a structured way, not going to the worst case scenario. Everyone I know is going to die. I don't know how I'm going to cope with it. As you said, it's, well, what does that mean? So, as you said, so it brings up, what resources do I need to deal with that? We can't develop those resources or even start to look at those until we know what we need. And the only way we're going to know what we need is by looking at the thing.
And I suppose there's probably a lot of people who very rarely think about the fact that they are going to die. Just thinking about, very practical things like getting yourself life insurance so that dealing with your corpse isn't going to be a big deal and a hassle for all the people who are, bawling their eyes out at the time. And that your income will be covered. There's a lot of people who don't do that, in part because they don't want to think about their own mortality.
I think it's a primal fear, and I can give you an example. I mean, my parents right now, and we actually talked about their death for the first time. They are approaching 70, and you can guess and you can guess their reactions. They are just like, we don't talk about that. Let's not talk about that. That was their primal reaction, and it was like they were almost angry about me bringing this subject on the table. And I think I'm listening to you, and I think there's the rational in us that says, yes, this is there, it's approaching, and we have to be conscious and aware about that in order to approach this the right way. But at the same time, these emotions that we all have, which is part of our bodies, these emotions like
Mm-hmm.
overflow on us. And it's very, very difficult. This is what I found out to control that. So is there like any practice that we can do? Of course, there's maybe meditation and stuff, which is coming from a Buddhism path, but is there something that from the Stoicism?
So one of the things that often when people say, well, what is Stoicism? One of the things that often gets brought up is what's called the dichotomy of control. There's some things that are in our control, some things that are not in our control. And it gets portrayed as if the things that are in our control are like totally in our control all the time. And among them are our emotions and our thoughts. That's not what the Stoics actually teach, because they think that habits play a really significant role. So Epictetus and Seneca will tell us that if you want to change your mindset, it's not enough to just snap your fingers and say, okay, death doesn't bother me anymore. If you have fear or disgust or something else going on because of death, well, that's probably rooted in how you grew up, how people were talking with you, the culture that you're living in. Epictetus, he's not the only person to say this. Aristotle says similar things too in his own tradition, and so does Plato. But he's got this metaphor of if the ship is tilting way over on this side, well, then you got to push it all the way over on the other side and hold it there for a while so that it comes back to the center. And this takes a lot of time. He talks specifically about anger, and he says, you keep track of it. So you go a day without losing your temper at somebody, good job. Now your work has just begun. See if you can go 30 days. And if you have, then offer a sacrifice, and congratulate yourself and all that. I myself do a lot of work on anger management. And if I go 3 days without losing my temper, that's amazing, So when it comes back to like death and things like that, if somebody's struggling with, feeling fear about it or not wanting to talk about it, it's probably going to take a lot of picking at it over time. And so this is what the Stoics call ascesis or discipline. Correlative to that is what they call paideia or education is a way it's how we usually translate it. But you could think about it as like being informed. Part of what the Stoics do, there's meditation is useful. They call that contemplation or attention. One of the other things that they do, and Buddhists do this as well, and so do other great wisdom traditions, is you want to have certain what they call dogmata or sayings ready at hand. Epictetus counsels us, when you encounter a harsh appearance, be ready to say to it, you're only an appearance and not the thing that you claim to be. So that's having something in your hand, so to speak, or in your head, or you could write it down in a notebook, or there's apps now that will give you this sort of thing. But having these things ready at hand helps us out. And how do we have them ready at hand? Well, we think about them each day. Maybe we drop a little list and we read through our little Stoic sound bites. And they're probably different for different people. Somebody like me who is interested in anger because I struggle with anger, well, I'll read more stuff about anger. I'm not so worried about death, but somebody who's really worried about death, there's all sorts of little passages that would be useful. Marcus Aurelius is particularly good on death, I think, too, because one of the things that he keeps reminding himself of, you remember the meditations are actually his own, writing to himself, that it doesn't pay to like get angry with people or be upset with people, because soon we're all going to be dead. And so, we want to get things done now and have good relationships with people now. And so he's constantly, it must have been a real issue for him, or else he wouldn't have written to himself.
Yeah, that's a fair point, yeah. I was going to say, I think just in terms of answering Olivier's question there, I think that's it. And it's about it becoming a practice. It's not something that we do and we tick the box. As you said, we don't just decide, I'm not going to worry about death anymore. Yeah. It's the same with all that. So it's finding, and I think that's the thing with death, and what we're doing is why we try and bring as much humor into it as we can. It's just about, just the little reminders to get used to hearing about it, to get used to talking about it, to get used to asking other questions about it. And over a period of time, I think it just starts a little bit easier. We're doing this because we think it's important for a lot of other people, but we're getting a benefit from this as well. Yeah. Every time we
let me ask you guys a question then. So I myself, I do talk about death here and there, but I don't do it as thematically as you guys do with your podcasts and with your workshops. Because for me, it's usually like a topic in a set of topics that a philosopher has talked about. Sometimes it might be more central, like if we're doing the Phaedo, of course, that you're going to talk a lot about death. Or if we're talking about Rilke, then it comes up a lot. I myself, I like that approach of, laughing about it and joking about it. And I know a lot of other people do, but I've also, and, a lot of times offended people and they get ticked off that I'm being, flippant or not taking things as seriously as I suppose they would like. And I understand it, and I imagine you guys must have run into that as well. And sometimes, it seems like I really did cross the line. And other times it's because people are a little bit too, what's the word? They're kind of, I don't know, they're trying to tell us all how we should be. But then there are cases where I know that I really shouldn't have said X, Y, or Z. So my question is, do you guys run into these? You guys use humor. Do you guys run into these sorts of things quite often, or?
I haven't come across anything yet.
Yeah,
people have gotten offended, or
to be honest, and maybe you can comment as well, Keith. But one of the surprising thing for us is the guests that we have, who are very part of this death community, if you want, So either they are in the end of life, and it's incredible how. Sorry, I will use authentic now, the
sure,
word. But they are very genuine and very open, and they are, we've talked to one lady who just lost her husband, and she was laughing, and she was, kind of, with us on this humor level as well. So it's kind of incredible that these people who are inside the death thing, they are open and ready to joke. So maybe the listeners, maybe it's something else. But the people that we talk about, they are very open. I don't know, Keith, what you think about it.
No, I agree with that. Anyone that's come on to the show to actually have the discussions about it, it's like they've, on some level, different levels, obviously, they've sort of made peace with that, and they can see the humor in it. Yeah, it'd be interesting. So we have to ask listeners if anyone is offended, but they need to write in and tell us, because at the moment, as far as we're aware, everyone's good with this. I think there is that danger. It's like, how can you laugh at death when life is so precious? I think that's where people go to in their head. It's like, well, it's that if I laugh at this, it means I'm not taking it seriously.
Yeah.
So it's almost like sometimes it's people can get themselves into a state where they feel, I have to worry about this, because if I don't worry about it, what does that say about me? It tells me I don't care, kind of thing.
That brings up another thing that as I was getting ready for this, I was rereading Cicero's Tusculan Disputations, where he's talking about Stoic philosophy. And Cicero himself is not a Stoic, but he's very attracted to it. And he likes certain elements of it and agrees with them on quite a few things. And he's also somebody who, his very doing philosophy is tied in with not just hopes, but also great political disappointments, and is a way to deal with his deep grief over the death of his daughter, Tullia, who he was very attached to. He's talking about death, among other things, in this. And then he talks about the duties that we often feel when it comes to mourning. This is interesting, because the Stoics were, they were all about duty, but they were about duty within certain limits. It has to be rational. And if you think about the ways in which we often approach other people's death, or I suppose our own, they're often quite irrational. I mean, thank God we don't do the thing of like wearing black for, a year or 2 years after somebody dies. Unless you really like wearing black, then you have an excuse for it.
Like Keith. Keith is always in black. But
oh, yeah?
No, not always. We don't do absolutes. Yeah.
So Cicero himself is writing about this, and he's saying, look, the Stoics are dead on that we need to think about how much we ought to be mourning. We shouldn't be looking for societal cues telling us that we need to tear our beards out or crazy stuff like that. But people do that. There are a lot of people, I think, who quit living their life because somebody else died.
That's it, isn't it? It's as you said, it's within that comfortable thing, and it's not doing it because that's what we should do, because that puts a pressure on us as well. It's not. You see people who feel guilty because they don't feel a certain way. They're going to at some point, but they go through this period where they actually beat themselves up because they haven't felt it yet, and they're just processing it differently.
Oh, yeah. I mean, that's true too. Yeah.
And I like that from the Stoic thing. It is a case of there's grieving, but it's going on for more than is necessary because you feel you should, or out of some false obligation. As you said, for me, what's practical is it's as long as it takes you to do it. And everyone is gonna deal with grief differently. But I think once it gets, and bringing the Stoic element, I think once it goes past a certain point, then we have to ask a question about, okay, what else is going on here?
Being somebody who had a lot of people die when I was young, and dealing with that, and then going to funerals and seeing the aftermath, over time, I still have colleagues who experience a death, like of a spouse or a parent or things like that. And I usually don't, I do the obligatory, so sorry for your loss, et cetera, go to the funeral. And then I usually follow up with them 3 to 6 months afterwards and say, okay, now do you want to, talk about things? Because by that time, everybody else has left them behind and said, you should have moved on. And you rarely have by that time. That's when the really crappy grieving often takes place, in my experience, when they're going through the roughest time, because the loneliness comes along with it. You're missing the person. Nobody else wants to hear you talk anymore about missing the person.
We get caught up in that's done, tick that off and move on. And it's a good point, actually, about thinking about that person maybe a bit further down the line and just checking in.
And especially now, I think grieving today, and you said it at the very beginning, how relationship with death today in the 21st century is very, very different. You said we used to wear black, when you murder. It's not the case today. Nobody does that, and it seems that this grieving process is forgotten somehow. It goes very fast. It has to go. It's very clinical, and we had a passing recently in our family, and it's kind of, what do? We are not used to that anymore. How do we react? What should we do? It's somehow this kind of habits that we had. It's forgotten, I believe.
It's interesting. If you belong to a large, close family, there's almost like a continual cycle of births and deaths, and along with that, certain other rituals, the funerals, baptisms, marriages, all that sort of thing. And so you never really get out of practice. But I think as our society is more and more, very small families, or these sort of like networked families, where we call blended families, I think there's less and less opportunity to get practice in about how do you comport yourself at a funeral.
You said that at the time when you succeeded to reverse an habit, you were doing a sacrifice to glorify that. So I assume you don't do sacrifices now after you don't get angry after 3 days, but maybe this is something.
I've never made it to 30 days, so
But
I suppose I could do something. Establish. The ancient Greeks also would like, when they won a battle, they would set up what they called the trophy on the battleground. So maybe I do that somewhere. I don't know.
But actually, the ritual and something, because you do workshops as well yourself for this modern world. It will be maybe one of the last questions, because I'm looking at the time, but is how do you pass this knowledge, this ancient knowledge, to today's world? So how do you make the link? How can you make the people tick right now? Just to say, well, there's some wisdom here. You can use it now with your apps, with your Facebook, with your LinkedIn, with all these things, with this technology. There's some relevance to it.
What our culture is passing on to each generation what we've inherited and thought through ourselves and digested. And I have children, and if I think about what I need to pass on to them and what format they need it in, it's definitely got to be mediated through technology, because there's something about even my son, this is going to sound really silly, and this is a little bit off topic, but he's at the age where when I was a kid, I was reading encyclopedias, and if it was in the encyclopedia, it must be true, And now we have the internet, and he watches channels like Game Theory, which I think is mostly crap. But he tells me these things that are on there, and it really captivates him. And some of it probably is true. And if I think about just how much of a hold these formats do have on the younger generation, it's unavoidable that we reach them through things like this, like a podcast or a video, or maybe something even more interactive. The situation is going to get tighter and tighter because families are smaller and smaller, and they're not getting much for this, as far as I can tell, in school or from other institutions.
We hope you enjoyed this week's episode. Again, please support the show by signing up at deathhangout.com or clicking on the subscribe button on our screen.